The laughter echoed from somewhere deep inside the coral ridge, a sharp, taunting sound that carried across the blackened jungle floor on the afternoon of September 15th, 1944. Somewhere in the honeycomb of tunnels beneath Peleliu's Umurbrogol mountain, Japanese defenders had just watched another American assault team retreat, and they wanted the Marines to know it. This was the moment when psychological warfare collided with industrial warfare, when ancient tactics of concealment met the 20th century's most terrifying weapon, and only one would survive. Corporal James McKinney crouched behind a splintered banyan trunk, his hands still trembling from the near miss that had sent shrapnel screaming past his helmet 30 seconds earlier. The smell hit him first, cordite smoke mixing with rotting vegetation and something sweetly putrid he tried not to identify. Then the texture, coral dust coating his tongue, webbing straps chafing salt-stiff against shoulders that had carried 70 pounds of gear through 115-degree heat for 9 days straight. The sound never stopped. Distant naval artillery rumbling like thunder, the metallic chatter of machine guns, and underneath it all, that mocking laughter from the caves. "They're laughing at us," Private First Class Robert Chen muttered, adjusting his grip on the M1 Garand that had become an extension of his arms. "Third time today, they've pushed us back from that ridge." McKinney said nothing. He was watching the two men approaching from the rear, moving slowly under the weight of equipment that made every other Marine's load look modest. 70 pounds of tanks, hoses, and pressurized fuel strapped to their backs. Flamethrower operators. The Marines called them Zippo men, though rarely to their faces. Everyone knew the life expectancy statistics, even if nobody spoke them aloud. The island of Peleliu measured 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, a thumbnail of coral and volcanic rock in the Palau archipelago that American planners had estimated would fall in 4 days. Operation Stalemate 2, they called it. The name would prove grimly prophetic. 11 weeks later, the fighting would still rage through a maze of limestone caves and tunnels that transformed every yard of advancement into a mathematical equation of blood and time. But on this particular afternoon, as Staff Sergeant William Nakamura and his assistant prepared their M2 flamethrower for another assault, nobody was thinking about strategic timelines. They were thinking about the ridge ahead, honeycombed with Japanese positions that had already consumed 2 rifle platoons and a demolition team. The Japanese had learned from earlier defeats. After the catastrophic beach defenses at Tarawa and Saipan, Imperial Army doctrine shifted to defense in depth, fortifying high ground, converting phosphate mines into military complexes, building interconnected tunnel systems with sliding steel doors and angled firing ports that naval bombardment couldn't reach. Some galleries extended 300 feet into solid rock, with ventilation shafts, ammunition depots, and living quarters carved from stone. Artillery spotters had counted over 500 cave openings on Peleliu's central ridges. The actual number was closer to 1,200. Inside those tunnels, Japanese troops could move unseen, reposition after bombardments, and emerge to fire from unexpected angles before vanishing again into the labyrinth. American superiority in armor, artillery, and air power meant nothing when the enemy lived underground. Conventional tactics, suppressive fire, grenades, rifle assault, had failed repeatedly. Riflemen couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. Grenades bounced harmlessly off angled cave mouths. Demolition charges sealed one entrance while defenders escaped through interconnected passages to fire from another position minutes later. What would you do? Retreat and declare the island too costly? Continue the slow arithmetic of attrition, trading American lives for yards of coral? or deploy a weapon so terrible that even its operators sometimes refused to look at what they'd done. Before we go further, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you're finding this story as haunting as we do, hit that like button and subscribe, because the next part reveals what happened when those flamethrowers finally entered the caves. The military designation was Portable Flamethrower M2. The specifications read clinically: fuel capacity 4.7 gallons, effective range 20 to 50 yards depending on fuel consistency, total burn time 6 to 10 seconds, loaded weight 68 pounds. The technical manual, TM3-376A, explained in dry prose how thickened fuel could ricochet around corners and force defenders to close firing ports, leading to suffocation or thermal injury in enclosed spaces. What the manual didn't mention was the sound, a deep, throaty roar like a dragon's breath that announced its presence before the flames arrived. Or the smell of napalm-thickened gasoline, an oily chemical reek that clung to clothing and hair for days. Or the way operators had to expose themselves completely to range the nozzle, becoming prime targets for the 3 to 5 seconds it took to deliver a burst of liquid fire. Nakamura checked his equipment one final time. The twin fuel tanks pressed against his back, connected by hoses to the wand-like projector he gripped with both hands. The ignition system, a small hydrogen flame pilot light, flickered at the nozzle tip. His assistant, Private Eddie Sullivan, carried extra fuel cartridges and a Thompson submachine gun to suppress enemy fire during the approach. Behind them, a rifle squad waited to exploit whatever opening the flame created. The plan was simple in concept, horrifying in execution. Approach the cave mouth under, covering fire. Deliver 2 3-second bursts of flame directly into the opening. Wait for secondary effects. Smoke, screaming, silence. Advance with rifles and grenades to clear any survivors. Seal the entrance with demolition charges if defenders refused to surrender. But the Japanese had watched this tactic evolve through weeks of fighting. They'd adapted. Some cave systems now featured multiple chambers separated by bulkheads and rubble barriers. Defenders could retreat deeper, wait for the flames to dissipate, then return to fire on advancing Americans. Other positions had been booby-trapped with improvised mines and tripwires, turning flame assaults into suicide missions. The laughter from the caves continued, a psychological tactic designed to unnerve attackers and project confidence. American intelligence officers had noted this behavior in after-action reports. Defenders sometimes shouted challenges in broken English, made noise to suggest larger numbers, or simply laughed to demonstrate their contempt for American firepower. They didn't know what was coming. Nakamura rose to a crouch and began moving forward, Sullivan 3 paces behind. The covering squad opened fire, M1 rifles cracking in rhythm, a Browning automatic rifle hammering 3-round bursts toward the cave mouth. Bullets sparked off coral, sending chips of limestone spinning through smoky air. The noise was overwhelming, gunfire echoing off rock faces, naval shells rumbling in the distance. The high-pitched buzz of a Japanese Nambu machine gun answering from somewhere inside the ridge. 50 yards, 40, 30. The cave entrance loomed ahead, a ragged opening 8 feet wide, rimmed with blast-scarred rock. Inside, darkness, movement, the flicker of muzzle flash as a defender fired blindly toward the approaching Marines. 20 yards, close enough. Nakamura planted his feet, aimed the nozzle, and triggered the valve. What happened next would transform Pacific Island warfare and haunt the dreams of everyone who witnessed it. The flame burst from the nozzle like liquid sunrise, orange and red and impossibly bright against the gray coral rock. Then the roar swallowed every other sound on Peleliu. This was the moment that would redefine infantry warfare in the Pacific, when fire became the answer to questions that bullets couldn't solve. The pressurized stream arced across 25 yards in less than 2 seconds, hitting the cave mouth with a wet, slapping impact that sent fuel splashing across stone and into the darkness beyond. The pilot flame touched it an instant later. The ignition wasn't an explosion. It was a blooming, a sudden expansion of heat and light that turned the cave entrance into the mouth of a furnace. The napalm-thickened fuel stuck to everything it touched: rock, metal, flesh, burning at temperatures that exceeded 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Nakamura held the trigger for 3 seconds. The manual said 3 seconds. Training said 3 seconds. His instincts screamed to release it sooner, but he held steady, sweeping the nozzle in a slow arc to ensure coverage. The flame jet writhed like a living thing, its trajectory affected by wind, fuel pressure, and the angle of approach. Black smoke boiled from the cave mouth, thick and oily, carrying the chemical stench of burning petroleum mixed with something else, something organic that made Sullivan turn his head and gag. The covering fire stopped. In the sudden relative quiet, new sounds emerged. A high-pitched screaming from inside the cave, then another voice, then silence, the crackling of flames, the hiss and pop of superheated rock, something metallic clattering as it fell. "Second burst!" the squad leader shouted. Nakamura triggered the valve again. Another 3-second stream, this time aimed deeper into the opening, the fuel ricocheting off the angled walls exactly as the technical manual had promised, bouncing, splashing, finding its way around corners and into chambers that grenades couldn't reach. The flames followed, spreading backward through passages in defiance of logic, as if the fire itself was hunting. Inside the cave, physics became a weapon. The burning napalm consumed oxygen at a catastrophic rate. A single gallon could exhaust the breathable air in a medium-sized chamber within 30 seconds. The fire also produced carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and other toxic combustion products that turned interconnected tunnels into gas chambers. Defenders who survived the initial flames faced a choice between burning, suffocating, or emerging into American gunfire. The temperature inside rose to levels that melted human flesh and warped steel. The acoustic environment became hellish, flames roaring with a sound like tearing canvas, the crack and rumble of superheated rock fracturing, screams that echoed and doubled back on themselves until the cave seemed to be full of ghosts. Defenders couldn't coordinate, couldn't communicate, couldn't think through the sensory overload of burning alive in the dark. Fire doesn't negotiate. Nakamura released the trigger. 6 seconds of fuel expended, 4.7 gallons minus roughly 1 gallon, enough for perhaps 3 more assaults before requiring reload. His hands shook. Not from fear, though fear was there, but from the weight of the equipment and the realization of what he'd just done. Behind him, Sullivan was praying in Spanish, a quiet stream of words that seemed inadequate for the moment. The squad moved forward in fire team rushes, 2 men advancing while 2 provided cover, the dance they'd practiced 1,000 times, but which felt different now, approaching a cave mouth that had become an oven. The heat was physical, pushing back against them like a wall. 20 feet from the entrance, Private Chen could feel it through his dungarees. 10 feet away, the exposed skin on his forearms began to redden. They found the first body 5 feet inside the entrance. Japanese soldier, sprawled face down, rifle still clutched in hands that had contracted into claws from the heat. His uniform was charred black, smoking. Chen didn't look at the face. Nobody looked at faces. That was an unspoken rule that every man learned and nobody taught. The tunnel extended 40 feet into the ridge, sloping downward at a 15-degree angle. The walls were black with soot, still radiating heat. The floor was littered with artifacts of human habitation transformed into archaeological evidence. Rice bowls cracked from thermal shock, ammunition belts with cartridges that had cooked off in the heat, a photograph curled and blackened beyond recognition, straw bedding still smoldering, and bodies. 3 more in the first chamber, huddled in the corners where they'd tried to escape the flames and found only more heat, more smoke, more fire. The rifle squad cleared the tunnel in 10 minutes, moving through smoke that stung eyes and throats, checking each chamber with flashlights and bayonets. They found no survivors. At the tunnel's deepest point, an engineer placed a 20-pound satchel charge, rigged the fuse, and they all retreated to the entrance. The explosion collapsed 30 feet of tunnel, sealing the position permanently. What had been a defensive strongpoint was now a tomb. Rock and coral and the remains of its defenders compressed together into an unmarked grave that would remain undiscovered until archaeologists began exploring Peleliu decades later, finding caves with walls smashed by explosives and charred or melted by flamethrowers, and human remains with bullets still embedded in bone. McKinney marked the location on his field map with a simple notation: Cave 47B, cleared by flame, sealed. In the clinical language of military paperwork, 6 seconds of fire had become a tactical success. A position that had held up 2 platoons for 3 days was neutralized. The ridge could be secured. The operation could advance. But standing in the afternoon heat, watching smoke drift from the sealed cave mouth, McKinney felt something shift inside him. Eugene Sledge, a Marine fighting nearby on Peleliu, would later write that the fierce struggle for survival in the abyss of Peleliu had eroded the veneer of civilization and made savages of us all. McKinney didn't have those words yet. He just knew something had changed. Nakamura sat against a tree trunk, the flamethrower tanks finally off his back, drinking from his canteen with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. His assistant, Sullivan, was smoking a cigarette, staring at nothing. Neither man spoke. Around them, the rest of the squad busied themselves with equipment checks and position consolidation, doing anything to avoid thinking about what they'd just witnessed. "How many more caves?" Chen asked quietly. McKinney looked at his map. He'd marked 43 positions in this sector alone. 43 minus 1. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. "Enough," he said. The success at Cave 47B was radioed back to battalion headquarters within the hour. By evening, every infantry company on Peleliu had received updated tactical guidance. Flamethrowers were now priority equipment for cave assaults. By the next morning, supply ships were unloading additional M2 units and drums of napalm-thickened fuel. Within 3 days, flamethrower doctrine had evolved from experimental to standard operating procedure. The Japanese defenders, listening through their interconnected tunnel systems, heard the news in their own way. The distinctive roar of flame jets, growing more frequent, moving systematically through the ridges. The weapon they'd mocked, the cumbersome tanks that made operators slow and vulnerable, had found its purpose, and there was no defense against it, except death or surrender. But as the tactical reports climbed the chain of command, as generals studied casualty figures and advance rates, something else was happening on the coral ridges of Peleliu. The men who operated flamethrowers, and the men who watched them work, were discovering that some victories came with a cost that couldn't be measured in tactical summaries. What happens to a man's soul when he becomes fire itself? And what happens to the men who witness it? By February 19th, 1945, when the first wave hit the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima, every Marine infantry battalion included dedicated flamethrower squads. And every operator knew the statistics nobody spoke aloud. The question wasn't whether fire would win the battle, but whether the men carrying it could survive long enough to use it, and whether they could live with themselves afterward. Corporal Hershel Woodrow Williams crouched in a shell crater on Iwo Jima's southern beach, watching 3 separate flamethrower teams get cut down in 15 minutes. The island rose before him like a nightmare rendered in volcanic rock. Mount Suribachi looming to the south, the central plateau bristling with concrete pillboxes and cave mouths that leaked machine gun fire. Somewhere ahead, buried in that maze of fortifications, were 21,000 Japanese defenders who'd had months to prepare for this moment. The sound was different here than on Peleliu. The volcanic sand absorbed some of the noise, creating an odd, deadening effect, punctuated by the crack of rifles and the heavier boom of artillery. The smell hit harder, sulfur from the volcanic soil mixing with cordite smoke, and the sweet rot of bodies already decomposing in 100-degree heat. The texture was sand, black and coarse, working its way into boots and rifle actions and wounds, a gritty reminder that Iwo Jima offered no comfort, no respite, no mercy. "They're targeting the flame operators first," Sergeant Mike Kalana said, stating what everyone already knew. Japanese defenders had learned to prioritize targets, the slow-moving figures with distinctive silhouettes, the men whose weapons announced themselves with roaring flame before firing. Kill the flamethrower operator, and his supporting squad lost its primary cave-clearing weapon. Simple mathematics of survival. Williams looked at the M2 flamethrower that had belonged to Private First Class Robert Meyer 30 minutes earlier. Meyer was being carried back to the beach now, 3 bullet holes in his chest. The flamethrower had survived undamaged. Equipment always survived longer than men. "Woody," Kalana said quietly, "we need someone." Williams was 21 years old, a farm boy from West Virginia who'd worked in a silk mill before the war. He'd volunteered for flamethrower training because it paid an extra $5 a month. Now, strapping the 70-pound unit onto his back while machine gun fire crackled overhead, he understood that some bargains carried hidden costs. The tactical problem was elegant in its brutality. 7 concrete pillboxes arranged in mutually supporting positions, each one covering the other's blind spots, each one connected to underground bunkers via tunnels that allowed defenders to retreat and reappear. Standard rifle assault had failed. Grenades bounced harmlessly off reinforced concrete. Artillery had pocked the surface but left the structures intact. Only fire could reach into those spaces, but getting close enough to use it meant crossing 50 yards of open ground under concentrated fire. Williams studied the terrain. Shell craters offered some cover. A destroyed Japanese tank provided a brief screen. Beyond that, nothing but volcanic sand and enemy fire. The mathematics were clear. Most men attempting this approach would die. But without clearing those pillboxes, the entire battalion's advance would stall, piling casualties on top of casualties as men tried to push forward into overlapping fields of fire. What would you have done? Stayed in the crater and let someone else volunteer? Questioned the order? Or done what Williams did, which was to crawl forward on his belly, dragging 70 pounds of fuel and equipment through volcanic sand while bullets kicked up black dust around him. He made 3 trips, 3 separate crawls across that killing ground, each time returning for more fuel after exhausting his tanks, each time somehow avoiding the bullets that mathematics said should have hit him. On the first approach, he burned out 2 pillboxes, the flame jets turning concrete structures into ovens that cooked everyone inside. Defenders who fled were cut down by covering rifle fire. Those who stayed died in the heat. On the second trip, Williams worked his way between positions, using terrain and smoke for concealment, hitting 3 more pillboxes in quick succession. The technique was by now refined through dozens of similar assaults across the Pacific. Approach low, rise to firing position, deliver 2 quick bursts, drop and relocate before defenders could adjust fire. 6 seconds of flame, then movement, then 6 more seconds, the rhythm of industrial murder. The 7th pillbox was different. It had clear sight lines to Williams's approach route and defenders who understood what was coming. They waited until he was committed, then opened fire. Williams felt the impacts, bullets hitting the fuel tanks on his back, punching through metal, venting pressurized fuel that sprayed across his shoulders and neck. 1 spark, 1 fragment of tracer round, and he would have become a human torch. The fuel vented. The tanks didn't ignite. Williams delivered his burst into the pillbox, sealed it with flame, and crawled backward, leaving a trail of leaking fuel across volcanic sand that would haunt his dreams for the next 60 years. 4 hours of fighting. 7 pillboxes neutralized. An entire battalion's advance made possible by one man's repeated willingness to cross that killing ground. For this action, Williams would receive the Medal of Honor. In his own words, recorded decades later, "I strapped a flamethrower on my back and started crawling toward the pillboxes. If I crawled backwards, they would have got me." But the citation didn't mention what happened afterward, when Williams sat in a replacement bunker that night, hands shaking so violently he couldn't light a cigarette, unable to close his eyes without seeing the pillbox entrances transformed into mouths of flame. The medal didn't capture the recurring nightmares, the hypervigilance, the decades of waking at 3 a.m. with his heart hammering and his sheets soaked with sweat. The psychological cost of flamethrower operations was becoming apparent across the Pacific. Medical officers began documenting symptoms among operators that resembled shell shock but carried additional dimensions: guilt, moral injury, recurring visual intrusions. Some operators requested transfer to rifle companies, accepting lower pay to escape the flame. Others developed physical symptoms: tremors, insomnia, gastrointestinal problems with no apparent organic cause. One operator, interviewed after Iwo Jima, described it plainly. "You can't unhear the screaming. You can't unsee what fire does to a human body. And you can't forget that you were the one who did it, even though they told you it was necessary, even though it saved your buddies' lives." The armored LVT variants helped some. Tracked vehicles fitted with flamethrowers that could approach cave mouths under armor protection, delivering longer bursts of flame from relative safety. But even the tank crews reported psychological strain. The difference between killing at a distance with artillery and killing up close with fire was the difference between abstraction and intimacy. Fire made death personal in ways that bullets didn't. By late February, Iwo Jima's cave network was being systematically burned, sealed, and collapsed. Engineers perfected the technique: demolition charges at the entrance to stun defenders, flamethrower bursts to ignite interior spaces, follow-up charges to collapse tunnels and seal them permanently. The island's volcanic rock, porous and fractured, channeled flame and smoke through natural fissures, spreading fire beyond the intended target areas. Post-battle analysis would reveal the physiological reality of what flamethrowers did in enclosed spaces. Thermal injury to skin and airways, inhalation burns from superheated gases, oxygen depletion leading to asphyxiation, toxic combustion products causing cellular damage even in defenders who never saw flame. Modern medical research would later confirm what Marines suspected in 1945, that many cave defenders died from hypoxia and carbon monoxide poisoning before the flames reached them, suffocating in darkness as fire consumed the air. The moral complexity haunted everyone. Flamethrowers were tactically decisive. They solved problems that no other weapon could address. They saved American lives by neutralizing positions that would otherwise require costly frontal assaults. The casualty math was indisputable, but they also represented a crossing of some unspoken line, a weapon that felt wrong even when it was right, that left operators and witnesses struggling with questions that tactical manuals didn't address. Eugene Sledge, fighting through Peleliu and Okinawa, would write after the war about watching flamethrower teams work. I felt sickened by the horror of it all, yet realized that it was necessary. That tension between necessity and revulsion, between tactical success and moral cost, defined the flamethrower experience for everyone who participated in or witnessed these operations. By March, Iwo Jima was declared secure. The flag flew on Mount Suribachi. The casualty figures were staggering. Nearly 7,000 Americans dead, 20,000 wounded. Almost all 21,000 Japanese defenders killed. The island's cave system, mapped after the battle, revealed over 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, every one of them cleared by men with flamethrowers, grenades, and demolition charges. But the true cost wouldn't be calculated for decades. When veterans like Woody Williams spoke at schools and memorials, still struggling to explain what it meant to carry fire into darkness, still wondering if he'd done the right thing even as the medal hung around his neck. The weapon had proven itself. The question was, what had it cost the men who wielded it? 60 years after the last flamethrower burst echoed across Peleliu, an archaeologist's flashlight beam caught something embedded in blackened coral, a human jawbone with 3 bullets still lodged in the bone, surrounded by walls melted smooth as glass by fire. The caves remembered everything the living tried to forget. Dr. Sarah Chen lowered herself into what her survey map designated as Cave Complex 17, part of a 2005 research expedition documenting Peleliu's battlefield archaeology. The air inside was thick and stagnant, 40 degrees Celsius with 98% humidity, even decades after the fighting. Her headlamp illuminated walls that told a story in multiple languages, blast craters where demolition charges had detonated, bullet scars pocking the limestone, and everywhere, the unmistakable signature of extreme heat. Rock faces discolored brown to black, surfaces that had partially melted and re-solidified, soot lines marking the high water mark of flames that had roared through these passages in 1944. She found artifacts scattered across the cave floor like museum pieces waiting for documentation. Rusted pots and rice bowls, cracked from thermal shock, ammunition belts with cartridges that had cooked off in the heat, their brass casings split and blackened. A sake bottle, somehow intact, lying next to what her training told her were human femurs. And everywhere, the brown stains that decades couldn't erase, blood or rust or both, oxidized into the porous volcanic rock. This chamber shows evidence of sustained burning, she spoke into her recorder. documenting what needed to be said in clinical language even as her mind recoiled from the implications. Multiple scorch marks consistent with petroleum-based accelerant. Human remains exhibiting thermal damage and ballistic trauma. Estimated occupancy at time of engagement, 12 to 15 individuals based on skeletal count. 12 to 15 people had died in this cave. Not soldiers, not defenders, not the enemy, people. Young men, most of them, conscripted from fishing villages and rice farms across Japan, told they were fighting for emperor and homeland, promised that death was preferable to surrender. They'd lived in this cave for weeks or months, sleeping on straw mats, eating from those rusted pots, perhaps looking at photographs like the one Chen found, so charred she couldn't make out the faces, but the size suggested a family portrait. Then, one afternoon in autumn 1944, a Marine named Nakamura or Williams or Rodriguez, the records didn't specify which flamethrower team cleared which cave, had aimed his nozzle into this opening and held the trigger for 6 seconds. The archaeological evidence revealed what happened next. The fuel had ricocheted off the angled walls exactly as designed, spreading backward through the chamber, sticking to stone and fabric and human beings. The ignition had consumed oxygen at catastrophic rates. Burn patterns suggested the interior temperature had exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 30 seconds. The defenders had retreated to the back of the chamber, where their remains were concentrated in a cluster that suggested they'd huddled together as the fire advanced. Some had been shot. The bullets embedded in bone confirmed that. Others showed no ballistic trauma, only the thermal damage consistent with fire or the suffocation that preceded it. The cave had no secondary exits. There had been nowhere to run. Chen documented everything with photographs, measurements, and sample collections. The work was necessary. Battlefield archaeology preserved history that memory couldn't hold. But it felt invasive, like disturbing a mass grave that had earned the right to remain undisturbed. These caves were tombs and crime scenes and historical sites all at once, each interpretation true and inadequate. The work changes you. Similar findings emerged from cave complexes across Peleliu and Iwo Jima. Archaeologists documented the physical evidence of flamethrower warfare: melted rock surfaces, collapsed tunnels sealed with coral and concrete, skeletal remains showing mixed causes of death. Some caves contained dozens of bodies. Others held just one or two. Defenders who'd stayed at their posts until fire or smoke or bullets found them. The archaeological record was indifferent to nationality or cause. It documented only what happened, not why, leaving those questions for historians and veterans to wrestle with. The veterans were dying now. By 2005, most flamethrower operators were in their 80s if they'd survived at all. Many had never spoken publicly about their experiences. Some attended reunions, sharing stories with other men who understood. Others stayed silent, carrying their memories privately until death released them. Woody Williams lived until 2022, becoming the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from World War II. He spent his final decades speaking at schools and memorials, trying to explain what it had meant to carry fire into darkness. His message was consistent. He'd done what was necessary, what would save his fellow Marines, but the cost was one he'd pay forever. The nightmares never fully stopped. The visual intrusions, seeing pillbox entrances transformed into mouths of flame, persisted for 70 years. He found solace in faith and in the belief that his actions, however terrible, had served a greater good. Not all operators found that peace. Medical historians documented elevated rates of post-traumatic stress, depression, and suicide among flamethrower veterans compared to other infantry specialties. Some turned to alcohol. Others experienced failed marriages, employment difficulties, decades of hypervigilance that made civilian life feel like wearing a costume that never quite fit. The psychological research was clear. Killing up close with fire in enclosed spaces left scars that time couldn't fully heal. Yet the tactical legacy was undeniable. Flamethrowers had solved a problem that no other weapon could address. They'd broken the stalemate of cave warfare, enabled advances that conventional tactics couldn't achieve, saved American lives by the thousands through brutal mathematics of substitution. Military historians credit flamethrower tactics with shortening the Pacific campaign by months, perhaps preventing the invasion of Japan that would have killed millions. The moral calculus remained unsolvable. Was it worth it? The question assumed a binary answer where none existed. The Marines who crossed those volcanic beaches believed their cause was just, stopping fascist expansion, defending freedom, ending a war that Japan had started. The Japanese defenders believed they were protecting their homeland from invasion, fulfilling their duty to emperor and nation. Both groups were human beings thrust into circumstances where survival required doing things that peacetime morality would condemn. The flamethrower forced that contradiction into sharp focus because fire, unlike bullets, felt different. It felt wrong in some visceral way that couldn't be fully rationalized by tactical necessity. Eugene Sledge captured it when he wrote about feeling sickened by the horror of it all, yet realized that it was necessary. That tension between revulsion and acceptance, between moral injury and tactical requirement, defined the flamethrower experience. By 2025, most of the operators were gone. The last cave clearers, the last men who'd carried 70 pounds of fuel and equipment across volcanic sand while machine guns searched for them, had taken their final breaths. Their stories survived in memoirs, oral histories, and the Medal of Honor citations that reduced horror to heroism through careful language. The caves remained. On Peleliu and Iwo Jima, park rangers and archaeologists maintained the sites, installing plaques and guardrails, conducting tours for tourists and historians. Visitors could peer into cave mouths and see the blackened walls, could touch rock that still bore the scars of 1944. But they couldn't understand. Not really. Understanding required smelling the smoke, hearing the screams, feeling the weight of the flamethrower tanks pressing against your back while bullets kicked up sand around your feet. Some things can only be known by those who lived them. In a museum in Quantico, Virginia, an M2 flamethrower sits in a glass case with a placard explaining its specifications. Fuel capacity 4.7 gallons, effective range 20 to 50 yards, loaded weight 68 pounds. The display doesn't mention Private Meyer, who carried one across Iwo Jima's beach and died with 3 bullets in his chest. It doesn't mention Corporal Williams, who made 3 trips across a killing ground and spent 70 years trying to reconcile what he'd done with who he was. It doesn't mention the thousands of Japanese defenders who died in caves, their final moments unrecorded except in the archaeological evidence of melted rock and charred bone. The weapon sits silent behind glass, inert without fuel and operator, transformed from instrument of war into object of study. History had moved on. Flamethrowers were obsolete now, replaced by thermobaric weapons and precision-guided munitions that could accomplish similar tasks with different methods. The technology evolved. The moral questions remained. What had it cost? The casualty reports provided numbers. Americans killed, Japanese killed, islands secured, campaigns advanced. But numbers couldn't capture what it meant to be the man holding the nozzle, or the man dying in the cave, or the archaeologist decades later finding bullets embedded in bone and wondering about the person who'd carried that jawbone, what they'd dreamed about, who they'd left behind. The final accounting was still being written. Each generation that studied these battles asked new questions, applied new frameworks, tried to understand what had happened and why. The answers kept shifting because the questions were never really about tactics or technology. They were about what human beings could do to each other when circumstances demanded it, and whether those demands were justified, and what it cost the people who obeyed them. The caves on Peleliu still smell faintly of smoke on humid days, or so some rangers claim. Maybe it's imagination, or mineral deposits, or the organic decay of tropical vegetation. Or maybe some scents are so powerful they outlast the men who created them, lingering in volcanic rock as a reminder of the autumn when mockery met fire, and both sides discovered that war had moved beyond what either had expected. The laughter from the tunnels had stopped on September 15, 1944, when Corporal Nakamura triggered his flamethrower for the first time. It never started again. Fire had answered the question that bullets couldn't solve, had proven that industrial warfare could penetrate any defense if the price was paid in fuel and flame and the souls of the men who delivered it. The jungle grew back. The caves remained. And somewhere in the archives, a tactical report summarized in clinical prose what had taken 6 seconds to accomplish and 80 years to understand. Position neutralized by flame. Advance resumed.